Today on the Bass Channel, I'm showing you how to dial in a variety of metal bass tones. So before we get too deep into it, let's talk about what we're using today to dial in these tones. To my right is a GK Fusion 800S with the matching GK 410 cabinet. And there are a number of reasons for using this specific amp, and we'll touch on a couple of those now. First off, it's got a tube preamp. It's got an overdrive circuit on board that sounds quite good. It's got a 4-band EQ, which is definitely going to come in handy when trying to shape the bass tone to fit the rest of the mix. In addition to just being a 4-band preamp, each of these knobs actually has a push function that gives it a different voice in that frequency. So again, it's just a lot of flexibility that's going to help us kind of maneuver some of these mixes and help the bass fit where it needs to and cut where it needs to. So as you can see here, a lot of these settings are actually still at the 12 o'clock position with some of the voices engaged, because this amp doesn't really need a lot of help to sound good in a metal context. But let's quickly run down what we've done here. So this trim knob is all the way up because that's kind of its default setting. Think of it like a variable pad switch. You know, sometimes amps have just a switch of -6 or -15 sometimes. On this amp, the trim default setting is maximum unless you're intensely clipping it, at which point you roll it back until you're only clipping on your hardest notes. So on this particular example, maximum was good to go. Like I said, modern voice is engaged. Our overdrive is on. We're going to notice a theme with that as we go through this one. Now this edge cut, the voice here, when you turn it on and off, you can either cut some of the top end of the overdrive or leave it. I've chosen to leave it to kind of help, I guess, accentuate some of the upper kick drum sound, because again, in more of a modern style of metal, there's a lot of syncopation between the kick drum and the bass guitar, and we just kind of want to have some sort of marriage between those two tones. So again, that's kind of the reason for leaving the cut off. On the level knob, there is a voice option for body, which just kind of gives it a little bit more thickness all around in the overdrive, so that, of course, that's on. Our bass is at noon, but our bump is engaged to give us some extended lows. Our contour is on to, again, kind of get out of the way of the mid-range of the guitars. We've also got the high cut engaged and this treble rolled down with the presence off, because we don't really need to occupy the ice-picky 7 kilohertz frequencies, but we do want to cut through tastefully. So the high cut is on for that very reason, and the treble is rolled back because we're getting plenty of treble from this edge over here that we didn't really need any extra help from the treble knob, so that's just rolled all the way down. So those are the settings. Let's check out the tone. And moving on to our second modern example, this one's a little bit more recent than the previous one. You'll see a couple differences and a couple similarities. So first of all, we still have the modern voice on the trim knob, but this output signal from the bass is a little bit hotter. It's a Spector multiscale, so it's similar to what we saw last time. But I think, if I remember correctly, Josh may have had the preamp set to some sort of boost. Either way, we've turned this down to compensate. Surprise, surprise, the overdrive is on. We still have the edge coming on. We haven't turned the cut on yet, but we've dialed it back a little bit because we don't want to cut through quite as much. As you'll see in a minute, this particular example is basically one note, and it's all about the rhythm and the syncopation. So we do want to lock in with that kick drum, but we don't want to overpower it, we don't want to overshadow it, and we definitely don't want to magnify any slight minor inconsistencies or slightly off time, anything that's not 100% on the beat, which theoretically it never will be. We don't want to magnify them, but we do want to make sure they're there. Again, the body is engaged to give a little bit more girth, a little bit more thickness to the overdrive sound. On this bass knob, now I turned the bump off because I don't want the extended low frequency. I just wanted a little bit more of the kind of tighter bottom end. Haha, I know. So that's the reasoning for that. Now, if we move over here, these are about the same as last time. The contour is engaged and the high cut is engaged for the reasons of getting out of the way of the mid-range and not being too ice picky. And then if we move over to the treble, again, the presence is off. We don't really need 7 kilohertz for this example, but we did want just a little more treble than last time because we've turned this edge down. And just like last time, the horn on the back of this cabinet is right at about the 9 o'clock position, so it's not quite off, but it has been heavily attenuated. Okay, now jumping back in time a bit to more of my forte, which is 80s thrash metal. As you can see here, this is probably one of the rare times where most of the voice is engaged and just about everything at noon was the perfect setting for the vibe we're going for. We're using the LTD TA500, which is a very unique sounding bass that I didn't really want to color it too much. I wanted the character of that instrument to shine through, but again, also kind of massage it to fit within the context of this mix. And it just so happens that with these knobs at noon, with most of these voices engaged, that fits the bill. But in the spirit of being thorough, let's just kind of touch on it a little bit. Again, we've touched on the trim knob, modern voicing all the way up. Overdrive is on. Now, this is the first time that we've seen this cut engaged because the bass itself is pretty bright, and while we did want some top end, we didn't want it to be ear fatiguing and ice picky. You're going to start to hear these words a lot throughout the rest of this video. You're definitely going to notice a theme throughout most of these tones. So cut is on, body is on to give it some more girth. We wanted the extended low-end frequencies. We wanted to get out of the way of the guitar mid-range, hence the contour knob, again, in light of getting rid of the ice pick. We've got the high cut, and we didn't cut the treble this time because, again, the bass that we're using has a pretty good treble frequency. We just didn't need it to be in the presence 7 kilohertz. We wanted it to remain in the kind of normal treble sound. Just a minute ago, I talked about this bass having its own kind of sound and its own character that just happens to suit this part of this song really well. Didn't really need a whole lot of help from the amp outside of engaging these voices, which just goes to show the amp is one big part of the tone, the pedals can be another big part of the tone, but obviously, so is the instrument. So for this next tone, it's the same song, slightly different section, completely different bass, and the exact same settings. And you'll hear that while it still fits the mix pretty well, you can still hear what the amp is doing, the way that we've kind of shaped the tone to fit the mix. The character of this dramatically different instrument absolutely shines through. All right, now this next tone features 0 overdrive. It's totally clean, and we still managed to get quite a heavy tone. I feel like at this point I don't need to talk about the trim knob anymore, so let's move on. The normal is engaged, and all of these overdrive knobs are disengaged, so these are doing nothing at the moment. Moving on over here, we've turned the bump off because we don't quite need the extended low end. We just wanted a little bit more of the standard, I guess you could call it, low end. The contour is on because, again, as you're probably not surprised to hear, we're trying to get out of the way of the guitar mid-range. But we did want a little bit more low mid because, again, this is a clean sound. There's not as much compression. There's not as much harmonic saturation. It's a little less full in areas. I'm sure there's a better way to say that, but it's just, again, it's not quite as compressed and saturated. So we wanted to fill out that low mid a little bit more. But because this is clean fingerstyle, we did want to eliminate some of the clicky-clacky, ice-picky treble frequencies. So we've engaged the high cut, we left the treble alone, and on the back of the cabinet, the horn is right at the 12 o'clock position. This next example is still clean, but it's actually me playing this time, a completely different bass than last time, and I'm using a pick. So moving on over here, we can skip the trim knob, we get how that works. Clean is still on, which means this overdrive section is still off. Moving on over here, we did some different stuff. This time the bass bump is engaged to give us those extended low frequencies. The contour, again, as you're not going to be surprised to hear, is engaged to get out of the way of the mid-range of the guitars, but the low mid is there just to help fill it out. I am using an active bass with a pick on this one, so the high cut is on, but we did want a little bit more clarity in those high mid frequencies. And for the first time so far this video, the presence is actually engaged to give us, again, more top end. And because of the bass and the mix and the way that I'm playing and all that stuff, it never gets to a place where it's ear fatiguing and ice picky. It just remains clear and precise. And on the back of the cab, the horn is still at the 12 o'clock position. Both of the next two settings come from records with notoriously ugly, trashy production, the first one being one of my favorites, Saint Anger. So let's roll over here and see what sounds we've got. I've actually now, for the first time in this video, switched the voice to the more vintage voicing, which is going to give a little bit more mid-range character to it. A little less hi-fi, if you will. Our overdrive, again, is on to give it some ugly, nasty, gritty, overdriven character, therefore we've turned it up. The cut is engaged to, again, not get too ice picky, but we did want some cut, more of a pleasant cut, if you will. Body is again turned up for a little extra girth. Now here is where it gets real fun. Now, if you've listened closely to the Saint Anger album on a good system, love it or hate it, there is a wealth of low end on that record coming from the kick drum and the bass. So I've tried to kind of recreate that here. Bass bump is on for those extended frequencies, and it's been turned up so we can have more of them. Low mid at noon with contour engaged just was a perfect way to get out of the way of the mid-range of the guitar. High mid is still at noon with the high cut off because we've added so much dirt and, for lack of a better word, mud over here in the overdrive section. We wanted to get a little bit of that clarity back in this high mid, high cut control, so the high cut is off. And the treble presence knob, presence is off, but treble is at noon. So this is the best tone that I could dial in to complement this notoriously trashy production. My second favorite kind of trashy sounding record is Volume 3 Subliminal Verses from Slipknot. So the main goal here, again, was to complement the mix, filling out the mids and all the other different frequencies where it needed, while staying out of the way of the ones that it didn't. So we still have our vintage voice to give us, again, a little bit more mid-range, but this is a Spector pulse bass that we're using, and my god, it is loud. So the trim knob is now all the way down. Again, our overdrive is on at noon, our cut is on because, again, we don't want to get any ear fatigue going on. Level is at noon with the body turned off. Bass bump is engaged with a little bit of an increase in the level. Here's where it gets interesting in the mid-range is with the contour off, whatever mid-range is coming through, whatever frequency that is, just with Josh playing this Spector pulse bass to this song, just fit perfectly. So therefore, the low mid is at noon, the contour is off. The high cut is on because Josh plays pretty heavy on the fingers there, so we didn't want to get too much of that ear fatigue, ice pick, fretboard clack. And the treble and presence is again at noon with the presence off. And for these final few examples, we're going even further back in time when metal sounded very far removed from what it is today. It's hard to call some of these bands metal when you have bands like Lamb of God and Slipknot and Trivium and Periphery and Gojira and whoever else that you like from the more modern era. By those standards, it's kind of hard to call Rush and Kiss and Led Zeppelin and some of those bands metal, but at the time, they were pretty damn heavy. So for this example, it's yet again another one of my favorites. The band is Rush, the song is Natural Science, the album is Permanent Waves, and the bass is a Rickenbacker. Now originally it was a 4001, this time it's the 4003, and when this sample was recorded, this bass was all stock. So surprise, surprise, we have our trim knob maxed out for this vintage Rickenbacker sound and in the vintage voicing to complement a more vintage recording. We've got the overdrive on, the edge at noon with the cut disengaged because again, this is early Getty on a Rickenbacker. We definitely want that top end to cut through. Level and body is off, as well as the bass bump, because again, this album was recorded in '79, released in 1980. Even on a good system, when you go and listen to those records, there's not a lot of sub information. It's more of a, for lack of a better term, vintage low end. Same thing with the low mid contour. The contour is off to give it a little bit more mid-range cut, as well as in the high mids. Now again, the high cut is off because this Rick, all stock, this 4003, like I've said before, doesn't quite have that Chris Squire, Geddy Lee sound that a lot of us maybe build up in our head a little bit. I just wanted to bring that out. I wanted to bring out what we think those basses sound like based on those recordings here in this amp. So the high cut is off and the high mid is turned up for that extra articulation. Presence is on, again, for some more of that clicky sound, but it's not fatiguing. And it's been rolled back just a little bit to make it even less fatiguing. And in an effort to get a little bit more vintage, the horn is back down to the 9 o'clock position. Keeping it vintage, keeping it fun, we're moving over to Iron Maiden, Steve Harris, Wrathchild. So I'm going to just quickly go through it because it's largely kind of the same and a lot of the same reasoning for the last tone, but we've got vintage voice with trim at max, we've got the overdrive on, the cut and body where they were for vintage reasons. Bump is off, bass is up, contours off, low mid is up. Now the high cut is on with the high mid increased a little bit because again, we're talking about Steve Harris. We got a lot of fingerstyle articulation that we really need to cut through this wall of guitars here. But we didn't need so much treble in the 7 kilohertz frequency, so we've turned the presence off and rolled the treble back just a little bit. And again, in the spirit of that kind of late 70s, early 80s vibe, sound, and available gear, the horn is back down to the 9 o'clock position. that just about does it. Those are a handful of examples of my favorite tones, some of the best tones that I could pull out of my favorite recordings from the last 40 or 50 years. Now, I am in no way claiming that I am the authority in dialing tones. I'm not a producer, I'm not an engineer. I've actually never professionally worked in the music business outside of doing what I'm doing right now in my life. I've just had a couple people in the comments say that I have a pretty good ear for tone. Thank you very much, I appreciate that, because I have zero formal training, just 7 years experience doing what we're doing right here. So hopefully this was some value to you if you're trying to figure out how to navigate a relatively dense mix or a very specific mix, or even just a regular mix in general. Hopefully this was helpful to you in some of my mindset and my mentality in fitting a mix, where to pop out and where to hide away. I think this amp does a pretty good job at just about everything we threw at it, with all of its versatility in those voices, the 4-band, the overdrive, the tube preamp. This isn't really an amp that gets talked about a lot in the metal sense. There's a couple other brands that do. And I think this GK amp, while its forte has always kind of been in the clean hi-fi thing, and it does that really well, it really shines in a metal context, especially in that specific kind of high-mid treble frequency that you do need to peak out. Not to mention these specific high-mid and treble frequencies that you would need to attenuate. It's pretty much all here. All of these tones, like you saw, didn't use any extra pedals. There were a couple different mics, but it was all just this rig, this amp, and this cabinet. So again, I think that's enough of my ending ramble. Again, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching. Like the video, dislike the video, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you thought. And I think that's just about all I have to say. So be safe, and I will see you next time.